Hello and welcome, my name is Trismegistus and today we're going to be reading through and putting a bow on the latest Factorio Friday Facts. Friday Facts 438, Space Age Wrap-Up. Posted by Albert, Donny1 and Coverix. Hello, it has been a month since the Space Age release and things are settling into a steady state. It's a good time to wrap things up and discuss our future plans. Space Age Soundtrack Update by Albert and Donny1. The Factorio Space Age original soundtrack album has been greatly updated on Steam. Soon it will be in the game also. The edition consists of a second disc, labelled Original Game Soundtrack, and it contains all the soundtrack found in the game, properly mastered. This is 50 tracks in total. Finally, you will be able to find your favourite track in the album, for sure. The interludes are not included. These are composed just for the game to properly jump from a track to another without breaking anything, and that's not convenient for the album. The interludes, I think, were the bits where it kind of improvised it a bit, although they're sort of based on, so it's how it picks them and sort of assembles the pieces that Peter put together. So I say that was the sort of improvised, fill pieces between tracks that was in a whole Friday Facts, I think. And obviously if those are kind of segmented and chopped up and moved around and what have you, then it sort of doesn't make sense for them to be on the soundtrack. When starting the project, we had a deal with Peter for 1 hour of music per planet. That would be 5 hours in total, which seemed, at the time, like a lot of music. Now that the soundtrack is complete, we can proudly say that each planet length is Space, 1 hour and 15 minutes, Volcanus, 1 hour and 33 minutes, Gleba, 1 hour and 55 minutes, Folgora, 1 hour and 42 minutes, and Aquilo, 2 hours and 1 minute. In total, we therefore have 8 hours and 27 minutes of ultra-fine Factorio music, perfectly mastered to enjoy it in the game and outside as well. You also have to bear in mind that 10 of the tracks are mixed procedurally in the engine, making the composition variable each time that it plays in the game. For the album, we have rendered an average version of each variable track in order to complete the album experience. The time length in the game can therefore easily surpass by far the total time of the album, especially if we count the interludes also mixed directly into the game. Now that sort of mixing of the tracks procedurally, I don't think is covered by that Friday Facts. I think that Friday Facts is mostly around those interludes and chopping them up, but maybe that's included in that as well. But certainly that, I'm not sure, have I noticed that? It feels like I have noticed that, where some of the tracks are, because mixing is where you set like the levels of different instruments in the composition, and it feels like sometimes I've noticed the tracks in a different way, if you see what I mean, compared to others. But that may be just me, projecting things onto something, even though it's not really there, sort of thing, or I haven't really noticed. But yeah, that's interesting that it procedurally mixes the tracks as well. If we count the first disc, labelled Factorio Space Age Soundtrack Composers Mixes, which consists of Peter's selection of his 17 favourite tracks, and remixed by himself in an album format, with a total length of 2 hours and 4 minutes, and we add the total length of the second folder, we end up with 10 hours, 31 minutes and 49 seconds of Factorio music. This is such a big piece of an album, isn't it? That's a lot of music for a indie game and what have you. That is quite a lot. It's a hell of a lot to put out as a soundtrack. I mean, that's basically, the majority, when you get film soundtracks, they're not generally all of the film music sort of thing. They'll be remixed and put, because you can't just sort of stick all of the music onto a disc. Because it has a particular flow to it, and pieces may flow into each other, and it may be composed, and then it's reassembled in the actual film in a different order, that sort of thing. So it's interesting that they've put all of it on, basically. It's also interesting, I'll be honest, that 17 tracks on the on that soundtrack version it really is a selection. So if we say that those are tracks that are in the other stuff, as it were. So that 2 hours is part of the 8.5 hours. It's just they're picked out and remixed and formatted and what have you to be a soundtrack album sort of thing. So if we say there's 8.5 hours of original music, that is being included, and then, say, 2 hours of it sort of redone, as it were. That's quite a small, so effectively saying 2 out of 8, so that's a quarter of the track was all that was in that first album, and so the other 3/4 are now in the second disc, as it were. So I have listened to I think I mentioned this on stream. I don't think I mentioned it on the Friday Facts, but I did kind of listen to the album, the soundtrack. My reaction to it was a little bit mixed, because it was quite heavily focused, if I'm honest, and it was one of the things I was surprised about, and this maybe explains it a bit more. It seemed to be quite heavily focused on the Folgora tracks, the sort of more electronica and more sort of complex compositions and stuff like that, and it didn't feel like, I mean, there were tracks from everything, there was clearly a space track and what have you, but it didn't feel like they were very balanced, if you see what I mean. And if that's because Peter's picking his favourites, that makes a lot more sense. That's a sort of he's gone for the ones that he likes, and so it's more weighted towards Folgora, therefore. It is also interesting that, and I say, my sort of reaction to it, therefore, was a little bit mixed. I did like, there was one of the Folgora tracks was a really nice one, and, quite ambient, but the others are a bit complex. And my sort of reaction to it was, I didn't dislike it as an album sort of thing, but what I've been able to do with the other, the previous base game soundtrack, is just have it on as like a background thing, because it's very ambient, set of music, and it's very minimalist, and it sort of works as just a background for me. And I've discussed on many times before, I have kind of audio issues in that I get kind of sensory overload and stuff like that. If there's too much music and I'm not listening to the music, music in the background is can be a problem for me in games. And so that's why one of the fundamental reasons I really loved that first soundtrack, because it really did just fade away, and it was just creating that atmosphere without me really necessarily listening to it all the time, except to occasionally hear it and then pay attention to it and really enjoy it in that way. Whereas the soundtrack in the new game is much more, it's like a proper soundtrack, and that's good in the sense that it's, I guess, more diverse and interesting and those points of view. But as music to listen to, for me personally, it's all a bit, I say, it goes back to this thing, I basically turn the music off in every game, because it's too much input for me when you've got the visual stuff going on and you're listening for the proper sound effects and what have you, notifications, all this sort of stuff. And so the new soundtrack, there are some particular tracks I really like, but it's like music you would want to listen to and actively listen to, rather than just have in the background, for me personally. And I say, I think it's really good, but I suppose an example is, there are certain albums that I've heard so many times that what I do when I'm working and I need to focus is I'll just put them on my little player thing, and just have them there, and it's just in the background basically. I'm not really listening to it usually. Occasionally I'll zone into it and zone out of it. Now, there's surprisingly complicated pieces of music as it happens, but it's not ambient music, as it were. It's proper songs, but I've just heard them so many times that they're just part of my background consciousness, as it were. And so that's what I was able to do with the Factorio soundtrack. I don't think I'll ever really get there with the new one, because it's too proper music. It's too, you have to listen to it to enjoy it. And I, as I say, I get overload on that. I've really gone into depth explaining that yet again, even though I've explained it loads of times before. But it's just to give you the context that I don't dislike the soundtrack. It's not one I'm gonna use in the same way. Effectively, I'm not gonna stick it on in the background while I'm doing editing and just have it as some ambient sound, because it's too complex. Now, as it happens, some of the tracks I think are much more gentle and backgroundy and ambient, but they weren't really on that soundtrack. So what I might do is have a good listen to this new one, the disc 2, and see if I can pull out like my own playlist, of like more ambient, more quieter tracks, as it were. So yeah, I guess the main point there really is it's nice to have the choice. It's nice to be able to say, right, well, I mean, how many tracks are there going to be? If there's 17 in the 2 hours, there's got to be dozens of them. There's got loads of actual tracks. So being able to pick out my favourite 20, as it were, and have a little playlist for them is going to be really cool. Space Age Wrap-Up by Curretn. The current bun. I still remember saying something about 150 bugs being listed on the forums in Friday Facts 360, and some of the media taking it as Factorio 1.0 is still a bit on the buggy side. While obviously we allowed the release, it was because almost all of those bugs were tiny corner case inconsistencies, or something that almost never happens, which we take a look at anyway, but doesn't make the game really bad. So I really remember that actually. It was, I don't know, it's one of the problems with like openness in a sense, and Curretn kind of goes on to explain it, but this 361, they were kind of giving the lowdown, and there was a note of, because this is this thing, I mean, because it's such a, active community in terms of reporting bugs, and it, even when they're tiny edge cases, and they're a dev team that will fix bugs even though they relate to a mod. They won't debug the mod, but if there's some bug that's like an interaction with the game, and it's not used in any way in the game, base game sort of thing, but it makes the mod play up more nicely with the base game, and then they'll fix that as well, sort of thing. So a lot of these things that they were talking about in 360 were absolutely tiny. They were just, nothing, basically. But I remember it really well. It was like, we're happy to report there's only 150 bugs. And then it's just that thing of, you can say something and someone interprets it in a particular way. And I don't think they were trying to make, it wasn't they're trying to make drama or anything. It was just, it sounds like a lot, doesn't it? 150 bugs. But I remember from the thing, these are so tiny little edge cases that it's literally one person has encountered it ever. And it's maybe always been there in the, the whatever it would be, 8 years of development. And, it's literally come up once and somebody's reported it as a bug. And so it's gone on the very bottom of the bug list. And, eventually they did get round to probably fixing it or working out actually it's not a bug, it's a feature. And yeah, that's how I really remember that one, because it was a sort of a salutary lesson in sometimes you can be too open in a sense and sort of saying it, and then you don't know what people are, how people are going to actually react to it. This experience doesn't stop us from being transparent. At this moment, we have 800 plus bug reports on the forums. But again, not many are serious bugs. There are a lot of duplicates, many are even features. When looking at our resolved bug forum, we've fixed more than 625 bug reports since release. And since we prioritise the more critical ones, the game should be pretty okay for the vast majority of people. Next steps. We will continue clearing the bug reports until even the smallest things are sorted out, or tiny things can be discarded, which will take around 2 months at least. Once this phase is done, we want to start prepping the last major release, for the foreseeable future at least, for Factorio 2.1. We don't know exactly what it will be, but some of the more risky changes related to the mod interface, quality of life and graphical tweaks are likely to be there. Basically, it's changes that are too big for putting into 2.0 stable. But don't expect anything too huge like a big content addition. It will be mainly just finishing touches and or cool little widgets allowing more contraptions. So I guess just to kind of clarify that in a little bit of a sense, because as you can see, I added a little bit in there, because basically there's going to be a threshold by the sound of things. So they might put some mod interface improvements, some quality of life changes and some graphical tweaks in, but they're not going to do anything of the scale of putting a new planet in or introducing an entirely new combat system, or those types of things aren't going to go into 2.1. One of the things that I've requested, that I think should be in there, and it's so tantalisingly close. I lost about an hour fiddling about trying to get it to do it, because it feels like it's just on the cusp, is this thing of being able to more dynamically communicate with platforms. So it's a bit like the whole thing of, like interrupts or something for trains, where you can say, right, now I've got, or where you do, circuit controls on your stations. You say, right, now there's enough stuff in the chests to fill a train carriage, so I can accept one train. Now there's 2 trains worth. Now there's 3 trains worth. So when you do that little bit of maths and you set on the station, accept 1, 2, 3, 4 trains, and then obviously they turn up and, blah, 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 blah. And it feels like there's something very tantalizingly close to being able to do that with platforms, because that's what I really want to be able to do. I don't really want, I think it's probably how I'm going to have to play if they don't introduce it, but I don't really want a platform that's just driving around all of my planets, just, holding tons and tons of stuff, so that, like a massive buffer chest, effectively. That's not really, that's fine, and like I say, I'll probably end up doing that, but I'd quite like to do something a bit, more dynamic that says, right, now there's a requirement for, 200 green belts or something on this planet. Order a platform up. Maybe it's sat around Nalvis. It goes to Volcanus. Then it goes to Gleba where the actual request is and drops them off, sort of thing. That's the kind of stuff I would quite like to be able to do. And it feels like it's tantalizingly close with the systems. And one of the things would be able to better communicate with the platforms. So whether that's, on the side of, it's a tweak and it will go in, or that's too much of a big system change, is like, that's basically my example of where, knowing where that dividing line is, that could be the side of it. It could be a bit too big, or it's a quality of life improvement, gives you enough, gives you more things to play with, basically, allowing more contraptions, as it were. So yeah, we'll have to see where that dividing line is, but of the scale of adding a new planet, or say adding new weapons to the game or something like that, I don't think we'll get that. I think there might be like one of those as a bit of a surprise. So it could be something like a Spidertron Mark II or something like that. Some improvement to a system, or some tweak that basically makes it so that it's ever so, that there is a new feature, as it were, but that's it. There's only one, and then everything else is just some new graphics and new changes to quality of life and improvements to the mod interface type of thing. However, it sounds like time-wise, a couple of months basically takes us to what? End of January, maybe, if you give them a couple of weeks of well-earned holiday. And then that sounds like when they're going to start on that and basically decide on, this is the list of things we want to put in. And then maybe a couple of months to do that update. So what we're talking mid next year, mid 2025, as the 2.1 stable version. And that'll be it. That'll be the end of Factorio then. Wow. Friday Facts schedule. After more than a year of continual weekly Friday Facts, we feel that it is a good time to stop now. Fixing bugs doesn't really create that many interesting topics, and we prefer to focus on the work for now. I can imagine publishing some Friday Facts once 2.1 development is underway, if we have something interesting to show, or whenever we have something important to say. So yeah, that's it, basically. That's the end of these videos. I've been trying to prep for this. I mentioned this on my live stream. I unfortunately had a car accident. I'm fine, there's no one's injured type of thing, but it's absorbed an enormous amount of my time for the last 2 weeks. Getting it all, put their insurance, etc., etc. That's to say, and it's not a call for some, I say everything's fine. It's just money basically now. But yeah, so that's my latest problem that I've had. That's kind of stopped me from doing the videos. But from my personal point of view, this kind of frees up this entire. It still takes the best part of a day to do even these simple ones. So that frees up an entire period where I can use it for recording and editing the things, because the writing the scripts is fun and I can do that at any time, but it's the recording and editing of it all together that is the biggest time consumer. So yeah, this kind of frees me up to actually produce some of these videos that I've been scribbling notes around. So it's good from that point of view. For me personally, I can kind of get to move on. But yeah, should I say this? I mentioned it on the stream, and I don't know, people reacted. Oh no, not that many people. There were some comments around it, and I'd intended it entirely humorously, but people have been unsubscribing, which is fine. And if you do want to unsubscribe, because there's not really going to be any speculation until those Friday Facts. If you want to unsubscribe and come back again when we get something a bit more interesting in those, then feel free. But yes, so I appreciate that people have been here just for those Friday Facts, really, the whole speculation thing. So it's very much appreciated that you have all joined me on this journey, as it were. If you did want to hang around for more live stream VODs and whatever videos I end up cooking up, then that's very much appreciated. But yeah, this has always been a fun hobby for me and a chance to learn some new skills. So yeah, there's no harm, no foul if you did want to leave. Statistics. Factorio players collectively played over 88,000 years on Steam only, which is more than double since the last time we checked in. I won't bother with all the statistics this time, but we moved from 0.34 lines of code per one buyer to 0.24 lines of code per one buyer. So we're getting more efficient, I guess. So how do you take that one then? So, that's basically saying, and even though they've added, double the number of code lines? In theory, I guess, maybe, because it's double the size of the expansion. I would have thought it was more, to be honest with you. But they've got more code, and yet they've gone to 0.24 lines per buyer. So in other words, the number of buyers they've got has more than exceeded the number of code lines they've added. Except, of course, and this is one of the points that Curretn made in some of the Friday Facts a long time ago, is that they kind of refactored the game, not completely, I don't think, but tidied it up. And this is the next bit we're coming on to, added in a robust testing system and made sure it went through testing every time an update was done. So they've probably actually chopped out a lot of lines of unnecessary code and in the optimization process. So I guess there's a bit of we took the number of code lines down for the base game, the number of players went up, but then also we added in the expansion. So they've ended up at a 0.24 ratio, even though both of those are moving. Tests. I want to restate that without our almost 6,000 automated tests, we would never have avoided introducing old bugs when fixing new bugs. And we hope that this process gets more recognition and game companies will recognise this approach as the gold standard. Here is our updated video showing all the current tests that we have in a 4x4 parallel grid. Enjoy. So we will play this through, but it's a bit weird because basically it involves loading up the game and then running the whole series of tests. And I think, because it talks about a 4x4 parallel grid, I think these are its separate, instances on separate, machines or virtual machines. So I don't think it runs, this many copies of the game on a single machine. But yeah, so these are probably, they've just, stuck them all together effectively. And certainly there is one down here that, if you watch this, it's a lot slower than the others. So we'll watch it through and there is sound to it and it's quite funny, the sound. So I will leave it on and shut up. But note that it does basically just have a big loading screen for quite a while. So there's going to be a chunk of me just sat here, with nothing really happening. So feel free to skip ahead to that bit anyway. So there we go. Yeah, rattling through what I assume is all of the automated tests in that grid, and say whether they do run, all on the same time on a single instant machine. I don't know, but I would suspect not. As I say, I assume it sort of runs them through. But yeah, the sort of purpose of that sort of testing. I say we used to do it in when we were doing model development. Basically, we had a standard set of tests that essentially went through every single bit of code, and the idea was that it's not always possible to understand all of the interactions of everything, particularly if you're coming in and you're just working on one module. You may not realize that it impacts something else, that maybe there's some call to some function that you're using, that function maybe it should be in a library because it should be generic, but actually someone's just cross-referred to it there, and so you fiddle about with that function, and suddenly this other bit of code that's calling that function doesn't get the right return, or the maths doesn't work, or it's not getting what it needs, as it were. And so suddenly the numbers being sent across, for example, instead of being in one format, or being a particular type of number, for example, or having a particular calculation done, it's wrong, and therefore it then breaks this other bit of code. And that's a type of thing you can use automated testing to spot, basically, because that allows you to just do your changes, you run the test through, and then you compare them, basically. So you say, right, this is what happened when we ran the test before. You did the change. This is what happens afterwards. Is it exactly the same? Now, what you would also do, of course, is add in extra tests for the bit of code that you're working on. So if you are adding in something to do with, well, as asteroid field being shown, you're adding something to do with asteroids, so maybe you add some extra tests to do with asteroids, or meteorites, rather. What does it call them? Yeah. So, that's the type of thing, and you add those extra ones in, and so that then tests your bit of code. And so then when someone else comes and makes some other change somewhere else, those are in the standard set of tests, and the test, therefore, has it impacted your thing anyway. Now, of course, some of those changes, and this is one of the things I always found, some of them you're actually trying to change things like game balance. Like, for example, if you've got a bit of code testing combat, and the whole point of the change you're making, it's like a balancing pass, and you're tweaking something so that you can't shoot an enemy, or you can suddenly shoot an enemy, or you can use a particular weapon, or you adjust a resistance or something like that, or introduce a resistance to a damage. Now, a lot of those are data changes, but you would typically, test them as well. But when you run it through, you're expecting there to be a difference then. And so what you would do is you would compare and say, is that having the effect I want? So if I'm increasing the resistance of pentapods by 10% to fire damage or something, then I run that new test, and does it show a 10% change in effect? And that can have wild knock-on consequences, in that if you set your test up to say, right, well, after shooting it with guns, then we shoot it with fire, and then we shoot it with lasers. If you've changed the resistances, maybe you make it weaker, and so it dies before it then does the laser test. So you have to do things like go in and make sure the tests are actually doing what you want them to do. And so, yeah, it was an interesting part of the development I did, in that coming up with the tests is interesting, and it always helps to have peer review on it. There's having someone else come in and say, well, actually, I think we should test this, or it should look at it that way, or have you thought about this, and should you test it, sort of thing. And I think that interacts with this system, so maybe we need some more tests over here in order to test that properly. So yeah, it's an interesting way of doing it. And so one of the things I would say about the whole gold standard, introducing the tests, it's probably, true, as it were, but Factorio is quite a systemic game. It's very, very focused on its systems, and that's not always the case in all games. There are obviously all systems in the end, because they're pieces of software. But if the whole point of it is things like dialogue changes and, the meaning. So, for example, if you're playing an RPG, and you change a piece of dialogue, and you make it so the tone is slightly different, I don't know of any way of testing that other than, somebody playing it and saying, well, this character suddenly seemed very standoffish, or they suddenly became sarcastic for no apparent reason, or, those sorts of things are not quite automated test territory, I would say. And it's kind of one of the interesting ways that games are unique. They're not all purely systemic in nature. That was a bit of a weird rant, wasn't it? What after? This is one of the most frequent questions I'm getting. Well, I'm not really sure, but we are playing with different kinds of ideas for the next game. Will we figure out something worth doing? Maybe. To clear my head and gather a little bit of inspiration, I decided to experience a fresh World of Warcraft world for a while. You can find me in the fresh server in the guild called Factory Must Grow. The game I'm thinking about is related to WoW in a similar way to how Factorio is related to Minecraft. As always, let us know what you think at the usual places. Okay, is that worth a little bit of speculation? So, one of the things that Curretn mentioned in an interview he did during the LAN party event was that he's been thinking about like RPG type games. I'm not taking this to mean, when it refers to World of Warcraft, I'm not taking that to mean that he's thinking about doing like an MMORPG or something like that. I think an RPG, sure, but from what I've understood in that interview, I think it's more focused around the systems part of it. So the whole, making it more, shall we say, complex and also kind of interactive in a sense. So how would we define the relationship between Minecraft and Factorio? So Minecraft was obviously there before Factorio, and there are some mods that Curretn never quite said that this is the case, but there are some mods that I believe were probably an influence, a starting starting point basically for Factorio, and they were to do with industrialization and automation. So I suppose one of the things that might be worth kind of talking about in parallels is obviously World of Warcraft itself was kind of inspired by EverQuest, where essentially World of Warcraft was like a way of smoothing off a lot of the rough edges of EverQuest. But EverQuest was very had a lot of grinding in it of resources, where you would set your character mining, and it would slowly level up your mining skill, and they kind of, as I say, smoothed off a lot of the edges of World of Warcraft in World of Warcraft, and sort of took the fun bits and kind of ditched the boring, grindy parts. But the fundamental point is if Minecraft was about building big structures and exploring and making things, structures and stuff like that, these mods added automation and industrialization to it. So it could be that automation aspect that Curretn is thinking about, where, because I know he's mentioned in that interview, he's very interested in the sort of leveling side of it, the whole powering up and improving your stats as you go, and so kind of focusing more on that would seem to be, and like a way of automating it maybe, and effectively, like if you say EverQuest is about your character mining, then setting them going, and you just basically watch them as they just level up ever so slightly to their mining skill, and then sort of in a sense bringing that back into World of Warcraft, where you don't, but automating it, so you don't do the mining, you automate that mining in order to automatically level your character up. And I say there's almost a parallel with like clicker games, where you sort of you start off by clicking the button all the time, and then you use what you get in order to build something or buy something that will then click for you automatically, and then you use the more revenue you get for that by getting a second one, and it does 2 clicks at the same time, and you double that up, and 4 clicks and 8 clicks, and you then get a super clicker, and it like double clicks every time. And those are sort of how clicker games generally work, where they just sort of build up the number of clicks and you end up where you're doing millions of clicks per second, but you're not doing them, it's automated. And it makes me wonder if that's kind of where his mindset is the whole leveling of the character, sort of making it into some sort of automated game in and of itself. So it's essentially like taking an idea of it and sort of saying, right, well, can we systematize that? How do we improve that system? How can we automate it better? Can we, if you say that one of the things Factorio does so well is that whole progression of, right, well, you've got yellow belts, you've got red belts, you've got blue belts, you now got green belts. And so it gets faster and faster and more productive each time. And so it allows you to scale, basically. So can you scale the leveling process in the same way? It's a bit like saying farming, mobs, as it were. That's something in World of Warcraft that you do manually. Can you automate that? Can you have some enemies that go out, or are just killed off automatically by your characters or your automated system sort of thing? So I'm wondering if that's maybe where he's thinking. The other thing that I believe, as I understand it, I'm wondering if the other possibility is maybe making a sort of a survival-y version of a World of Warcraft. And again, maybe bringing in that automation side of it in the sense of, or systematized side of it in that, where most survival games, you're doing a lot of stuff manually, can you build a machine that does it for you? So I guess that is getting more into the whole, satisfactory realm, I guess, where you're actually like building a factory in the real, in third person or what have you, first person. And, it's there and it's a thing, but it's automating the survival things for you. So it's, it's growing your crops and what have you. So that's another thing I thought maybe they might do. I am focusing very much, obviously, on the whole automation side of it. It's a sort of it's a expectation I've got in a sense because, it's a group of devs who are very good at building a systems-based, game that is about automation. So if you've got a skill set, why not use it type of thing. They're all very good at making these automated system type games. Then you would expect that they'd want to leverage that capability. Obviously, they could obviously hire extra people, or people could change their skill set or what have you. But yeah, at the moment they've got a team that's very good at building a system-based game. So you would expect that that's what that would be. And presumably, and I've said this before, I think it got a little taken out of context. I'm not sure I said it in the Friday Facts videos, but this game is Curretn's game. And that sounds, I say, when I said it before, people I think took it a bit as, in a sense, over the top, in that, of course it's Curretn's game. It's his company, and it was his original idea. I think it was several people, wasn't it? But, it's basically him that's, running the company now, and let's say others are, I think, less involved sort of thing. But conceptually, it's his game. What I really meant by that was that it was clearly Curretn's that when they introduce a new system or idea or what have you, or there's like the germ of a change, that comes from him. So that's him saying, I took the game away this weekend, I played it, System X, clever, whatever, is boring, or it's too complicated, or I got to this point and I didn't really understand what I was meant to do, we need to explain it better, or all those sorts of things. He, in a sense, is the root of them. Now, that isn't to say he's the only source of them. From what I understand, the others can come in and go, well, why don't we do this? Here's an idea for that. What do you think of this? And, you'll consider it. But in a sense, the buck stops with him, as you'd expect, as the owner of the company, as the lead game, the leader of the game, as it were, to kind of give it the tick in the box. Or because I know there are certain things, and he said it in the Friday Facts, that he doesn't really play with those systems, but happy for them to be there and for other people to get fun out of them. So there are things that have been introduced, in other words, that are not direct things that he's said and come up with. And I think that got a little bit lost in the way I said it before. But yeah, so the point is that it's coming from him. So you have to assume that the next game is again going to come from him. And since Factorio was something he was, that was his idea, you would expect it to be of a similar stripe. Plus, of course, if they suddenly pivot, and a lot of game studios do, especially indies, they'll pivot to something different, then you'll get a little bit of a I don't care about this type reaction from the community. And of course, they've got a big community of really, invested fans who are a kind of easy to tap into market. So although it'll probably be different and, a lot of people won't be interested in it, I'm sure that it will have similarities in a, kind of conceptual way, because they're then going to be able to tap into that market, basically. They need to be able to sell the game in order to keep the company going. So that was a real ramble, wasn't it? I didn't really have any structure to that. But yes, I just wanted to clarify something I'd said before, but also do a little bit of thinking about what this new game might be. Hope you enjoyed today's Friday Facts video and might consider coming back for another one. If you want to chat about the Friday Facts or Space Age, you can find me live streaming Factorio on my Twitch channel and YouTube at the weekends. Thanks for watching. Cheers. My name is Trismegistus.